Thanks a lot for everybody to come. So this is Ocean Nexus webinar. We have Ocean Nexus is a network of the researchers who devote their work to ocean equity, which we define as a social justice at the seas. And I'm trying to make this conversation as as open as possible. So if there's any question or anything you have in the audience, please put it in a chat or Q&A. And today's topic it's a title, it's the promise and the potential peril of marine carbon dioxide removal. So Ocean Nexus usually doesn't really go into so much of technical or new solutions because we are slightly skeptical bunch. But this time, thanks for Dr. Randy Abate, who's our legal advisor, introduced me to Dr. Will Burns. And Dr. Will Burns and then I start talking about this carbon removal and especially how can we be responsible and how can we actually bring the aspects of the equity into this conversation, which could potentially be challenging, and we definitely need a trust to start the conversation. And thank you for Dr. Will Burns who joined me and start having this conversation and a collaboration. So Dr. Will Burns is co-founding director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. It's a research center focused on the social science aspects of the carbon dioxide removal, including law and the governance and ethics, justice, and all the things which we care. Previously, Dr. Burns served as Associate Director of Environmental Policy and the Cultural Program at Northwestern University and the Founding Director of the Energy Policy and Climate Program at Johns Hopkins University. When I spoke to my colleague in University of Rhode Island, Dr. Emily Diamond, who also started working in carbon dioxide removal, she basically said, oh yeah, we're gonna have Will. He's a leading person and a figure in North America working on this issue. So I'm really glad to have you here, Will. Thank you very much to join us for the conversation. Yeah, Will, how long have you been leading this, your institute, responsible, I'm sorry. Right. Yeah. I'm going to repeat it again. Responsible Carbon Removal Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Okay. Sorry about that. How long have you been leading this institute? How long has it been?
Yeah. Well, we had a previous incarnation. We started off in 2010, so we've been around for quite a long time. But when we started off, we focused on another aspect of what's broadly defined as climate geoengineering, right? These large-scale interventions to address climate change. And we worked on what was called solar radiation management or modification, right? So these efforts to try to reflect sunlight away to reduce warming. And then eventually we split into to two centers, one that focused on solar radiation management and one that focused on carbon removal. And so the carbon removal aspect has been around since 2018.
Is it because I mean, you said it in various other places, the conversation about carbon removal tend to be very, technology centered and, science. I mean, we're social science, but not so much of the conversation is devoted to governance and, consideration of the community. And, I just wonder how did you come up with this? I mean, you're a legal scholar, so obviously you do care about the legal system, but what about the responsible part of it?
Yeah. Well, Our name up until a couple of years ago was the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, right? And
Right.
then we consciously decided to change it to responsible because we want to emphasize that if we deploy these approaches, right, they have to be done in a manner that's responsible. And responsibility for us entails everything from who should be responsible for paying for
Mm,
this approach if because it's extremely costly
mm,
enterprise if you're going to do it at a large scale through ensuring that notions of equity and justice and good governance are part of the equation if we're doing it at a large scale, right? And we'll get into that more in terms of
mm,
what that looks like, right? But
mm,
we decided that we wanted to emphasize that this approach has to be proceeded with a way that is responsible, right? And so we define criteria for that, and then try to help policymakers operationalize that,
mm.
and researchers and others that are involved.
Thank you, Will. So I have asked you to give us a short presentation, and you kindly said yes. Thank you. So we're going to have your presentation, and we'll have more chat and a discussion between you and me. And I'm also going to open the floor to the audience who probably wanted to ask you more in-depth conversation and questions. If you're ready, please take it away anytime.
That sounds great. Okay, I am going to share my screen and hold on one second. Gonna get this set up. All right. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, good. All right. So, as Yoshitaka said, I'm going to provide a very brief, less than 15-minute presentation that provides an overview of marine carbon dioxide removal in terms of our rationale for why we're looking at carbon removal more generally, why we're looking at marine carbon dioxide removal more specifically as a climate intervention strategy, what some of the approaches are specifically that we're looking at in terms of technologies and processes, and then what some of the potential benefits are and some of the potential risks. But again, very briefly, because we'll talk more about that in terms of the discussion. So just to set the table at the outset and why we're talking about these issues at all. As everyone knows, we have the Paris Climate Agreement, right? And the Paris Agreement establishes the salutary goal of trying to hold temperatures to quote well below 2 degrees Celsius, and at least aspirationally hold temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, if we look at the pledges, the so-called nationally determined contributions under Paris that the parties have made to date, and then map that against what would be necessary to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, we see that there is a massive gap. And so uh, recent analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates that instead of holding temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, much less 1.5 degrees Celsius, the pledges that countries have made to date put us on track for temperature increases of somewhere between 2.7, 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century in an intermediate emissions scenario. And if emissions are higher than that, and that's still a real possibility, especially with retraction by the United States, for example, in recent months, we could see temperatures rise 4 degrees Celsius or more. The United Nations Environment Program's recent emissions gap report puts us on track for temperature increases of at least 2.3, maybe 2.7 to 2.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, given what we're doing. And what we know is that if we see temperature increases of this extent, it could potentially have catastrophic implications, both in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. Just a few examples. If temperatures increase by 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, we could see the entire melting of the Greenland ice caps, right? And just this ice cap alone, the melting of this ice cap alone, would result in sea level rise of about 20 feet, right? Now, the good news is that would take about 1,000 years ultimately to transpire. The bad news is that once that happened, given the inertia of the climate system, we would be locked into those sea level rises for thousands of years thereafter, right? And that would have huge implications in terms of economic enterprise, ecosystems, and so forth. If temperatures rise just 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, it's likely we lose all of the world's coral reefs, right? And these provide critical sustenance for about a third of all of the species on Earth. And there's plenty of other incredibly negative impacts in terms of the world's oceans, loss of oxygen, warming, having massive negative impacts on fisheries, and so forth. If temperatures rise by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, we see substantial reductions in crop production, especially in the global south. We see substantial increases in violent weather events. We see substantial increases in disease vectors, right? And massive economic dislocation. And so the specter of these kinds of impacts with the projected temperature increases that we're seeing has led us to looking increasingly at the potential role of so-called carbon dioxide removal options to help us avoid passing these critical thresholds, or if we do pass these critical thresholds, helping us to bring temperatures back down below those thresholds. And this is a working definition of carbon dioxide removal options, right? So it's anthropogenic, it's human activities that seek to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, in other words, after the carbon dioxide has been released as a result of the burning of fossil fuel emissions, for example, or the manifestations of deforestation, we now try to remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably store it. Durably is a term that can be defined a number of ways. Most define it as at least 100 years, ideally more like 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 years, and durably store it then in geological systems, terrestrial systems, or ocean reservoirs, or utilize that carbon dioxide in products. Now, the next question is, how much carbon dioxide removal do we need? And the answer is because we did not get our act together in terms of reducing our emissions, and we have huge buildups of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we continue to emit large amounts of carbon dioxide annually. In fact, that those emissions continue to increase despite all of our interventions to date. The answer is we need a massive amount of carbon dioxide removal in the future, along with robust decarbonization of the economy, to try to hold ourselves to these temperature thresholds that we've talked about. And so, as you can see on the right here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its sixth assessment report said emissions pathways that limit warming to 1.5 or 2 assume the use of carbon dioxide, right? The deployment of carbon dioxide is important to counterbalance hard-to-abate emissions, things like emissions from the steel sector, for example, or cement, just sectors where even if we're trying our utmost to reduce emissions are most likely going to still be there, right? And so carbon removal can help us to offset those emissions and get to net zero. And ultimately, we're looking at probably having to remove as much as 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the middle of the century, maybe as much as 16 to 20 billion tons by the end of the century. And to put that in perspective, right now, we've reached about 0.37% of those objectives, right? So it's a titanic task ahead, and the amount that's ultimately required is going to be critically dependent on how much we can reduce our emissions, right? That has to always remain job one, but we're likely to need large amounts of this in addition. Now, up until recently, when we talked about carbon dioxide removal, we focused largely on terrestrial or land-based options, right? You've probably heard of some of these. One is direct air capture, right? The idea that we suck CO2 from the atmosphere as part of all of the elements of the atmosphere. We separate out the CO2, we pressurize it, and then we ship it for storage in land or in the world's oceans. Or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where we use bioenergy feedstocks like trees, for example, to take up carbon dioxide. And then when we combust those bioenergy feedstocks, we capture the CO2 and store them, right? Afforestation and reforestation, the planting of trees, the use of rocks to take up more CO2. But what's become increasingly obvious in the last couple of years is that for economic reasons or from a standpoint of sustainability, we're not going to be able to use terrestrial resources alone to get to 10 billion tons of CO2 reduction or 20 billion tons. And so we've increasingly started looking at the potential role of the world's oceans to be one of the options in a portfolio of carbon removal responses that get us to these objectives, right? And looking at the oceans, of course, makes sense in some ways because the oceans provide a yeoman's duty in terms of taking up CO2 now, right? As you can see here, the deep oceans take up massive amounts of carbon dioxide compared to what happens in the atmosphere or what happens in terms of plants and soils terrestrially, right? So the question is, are there approaches that can substantially expand the natural uptake of carbon dioxide in the oceans? And so we've started looking at a number of options, right? And these are the options that we that are being looked at most frequently now. And I just very briefly want to talk about what those are, right? So we broadly categorize these in as biotic, right? These are approaches that are using biology to seek to take up carbon dioxide in the ocean. Abiotic, which are chemical based, abiotic that are electrochemical based, and then an abiotic physical approach, right? So, what are some of these specific approaches? One that's being discussed a lot now, if we're looking at the left side of this equation now, is ocean alkalinity enhancement, right? The idea that we can introduce alkaline materials into the ocean, minerals such as olivine, for example, or wollastonite, that will allow us to convert more of the CO2 in the oceans to carbonates and bicarbonates, right? And when we remove CO2 from the ocean, that in itself doesn't result in reductions of CO2 in the atmosphere. But when you reduce CO2 in the ocean, it means that the pressure of CO2 in the oceans is reduced. and it allows more CO2 then from the atmosphere to enter into the world's oceans. And that results in a drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Another approach that's being discussed that is also an abiotic or chemical approach is ocean iron fertilization. The idea that there are areas of the ocean that have shortages of a critical macronutrient for phytoplankton production, and that macronutrient is micronutrient is iron. And so the proposal is to add iron to the ocean to stimulate the production of phytoplankton, which would ultimately result in more uptake of carbon dioxide in the photosynthetic process, and then would effectuate more drawdown ultimately of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Another approach that's being looked at that's a biotic approach is macroalgae cultivation and sinking. The idea that we would produce more macroalgae in the ocean that would take up CO2, and then we would sink that macroalgae to the bottom of the ocean for storage of that carbon dioxide for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years, right? And so again, we change the pressure between the CO2 in the ocean and the atmosphere, and we facilitate more uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere into the oceans. Another approach that is being discussed is artificial upwelling, which is the idea that we introduce more nutrients from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the ocean to again stimulate phytoplankton production. More phytoplankton, more uptake of CO2 in the photosynthetic process, ultimately more drawdown of CO2 from the ocean. And then finally, there's electrochemical approaches. One of the approaches that's most discussed would be land-based systems that would take in seawater, ultimately separate the acid and base elements of that seawater, introduce the base back into the oceans, making the oceans more alkaline, again, facilitating more conversion of carbon dioxide to carbonates and bicarbonates, right? Each one of these approaches roughly has been estimated to be able to potentially, at a very large scale, take up somewhere between 1 to 2 gigatons or billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? So they could, in conjunction, contribute substantially to the large amounts of CO2 that we think we need to be taken from the atmosphere. But each one of these approaches also poses risks in these ocean ecosystems. For example, ocean alkalinity enhancement, some of the minerals that we're talking about, like olivine, for example, could introduce potentially toxic elements into the ocean, such as nickel or chromium, right? And one of the keys is to determine what those thresholds are and what impacts they could have on ocean organisms, right? Also, there are ocean organisms that live at a very delicate balance when it comes to pH. And so increasing pH, which is the goal in these cases, could potentially threaten the viability of those species. And we need more research to determine what those thresholds are. Ocean iron fertilization could produce or privilege certain kinds of phytoplankton that ultimately might not be palatable to zooplankton in these areas, right? And if that resulted in a decline in zooplankton in those areas, higher order or species such as marine mammals that rely on zooplankton might be negatively impacted. Also, if you were to introduce iron into certain areas and stimulate phytoplankton production, those phytoplankton would take up more micronutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which might otherwise migrate to other areas, including some areas that are extremely important fisheries, and deny them those micronutrients, which could have a negative impact in terms of the fisheries in those areas, right? And in the Southern Ocean, for example, that's a particular potential threat, right? And so we need to assess where we could introduce these approaches without having those kind of negative impacts. Um, Artificial upwelling of nutrients could ultimately result in outgassing of CO2 that could eliminate the potential benefits of these approaches, and also the introduction of nutrient-rich waters from the bottom of the world's oceans to the top could not only introduce more nutrients, but it could also introduce a lot more CO2. And if that CO2 outgassed into the atmosphere, it could paradoxically actually exacerbate warming, right? And so it's something that we need to assess, right? So I'll conclude there by saying all of these approaches potentially have some very large potential benefits, but they also pose risks to economic interests as well as ecosystem interests. And we need a lot more research to be done in this context to determine which of these approaches, if any, should be deployed at a really large scale, where they should be deployed, and over what time scales. And that's part of what we're doing now, and part of defining what is responsible carbon removal. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Will. Shall we take? Yeah, thank you. That was very quick introduction. Really to just explain technically what it is carbon dioxide removal. So abiotic and biotic. But there is a paper you wrote, which Karen, can you actually put it? And which just really explains what you just talked about. What is a function, and also what are the risks. And I do understand very clearly, there are ecological or environmental risks, which comes into each of those, the approaches like IOF, I know OIF, ion fertilization. It creates potentially more phytoplankton and would lead to algae bloom, or kelp will actually change its ecosystem in a very sort of a delicate potential composition of ecosystems. Alkalinity will release some toxic heavy metals, and those, so like there's always kind of like this nature-based solutions, which if you're going to do it like a very small scale or lab base, you could actually see the impact, you could see the mechanism, and you might be able to consider you can actually mitigate some of those risks. But when we're talking about the potential reaching to this like a 10, 20 billion tons, and even just contribute to 10% of it, like 1 gigaton, I read somewhere it could potentially be a 25% of ocean surface. We need to use it in that scale. Well, I mean, is it possible for us to actually, or to what extent people do actually think we can actually measure and consider those risks and can actually mitigate it?
Yeah. Well, so as I said, with all these approaches, we're at the early stages of developing the research agendas and the protocols to be able to make those determinations, right? So, for example, there's an organization, an NGO called Hourglass, right, that is developing ecotoxicological protocols now, primarily in the context of ocean alkalinity enhancement, because uh, that really is the approach that we're increasingly focusing on when it comes to the marine CDR options. And so what they're doing is they're developing ecotoxicological protocols that help us to assess what the thresholds are at which we think the introduction of ocean alkalinity enhancement might have impacts on ocean-based organisms, what those impacts would be, how we determine cumulative impacts, how we determine temporal impacts, how we determine spatial impacts, right? Where, for example,
Mm,
the initial impacts of introducing large amounts of this will have localized impacts, but that will quickly disperse, right, as these minerals start to disperse in the oceans, right?
mm,
And then we have to be able to determine what those impacts are, right? And
mm,
so that's going to require modeling. It's going to require us actually going out and doing field research. Uh,
mm,
and then hopefully we're going to be able to make those determinations, right? And one of the complicated things of this also is doing comparative risk assessment, right? Acknowledging that climate change itself, unchecked climate change, right, will have huge negative impacts on marine-based organisms. And we need to acknowledge that and say, how much of the risk of the interventions are we willing to to accept in
mm,
that context, right? And how much can we reduce the amount of interventions with marine carbon removal by increasing our commitments to decarbonization, right?
mm.
And so that all has to be fed into the equation when we're thinking about making policy making, and it's a bit of a black box at this point.
I mean, I just think about like two ways to go. So bringing this conversation into more equity considerations. One is okay, we can compare the risk, and there's concerns about threshold, potentially tipping point, globally. We reach into the really critical stages, and obviously we have to mitigate those risks. But at the same time, by the cost of whom, that is usually the issue. And so, someone like, for example, if we are actually going to consider those heavy metal release and assess the risk based on the current the chemical pollutions and the risks for our seafood consumptions. That doesn't really cover, this is a funny bit, that doesn't really cover those specific seafood consumptions done or subsistence consumptions, which is really having very important role in subsistence fisheries.
Hmm.
Among the populations, indigenous populations or coastal populations. So, what happened was, okay, we've got to do something. This is a planet crisis. But all the burden actually, and then even institutionally pushing into those people who doesn't really have a voice to it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is really so our governance system is not set to help those people, but kind of like a more set to bring those new technology putting into it, but to push their interest off the side. Do
Yeah.
you think there is a potential, there's a way to avoid those, repeat those mistakes that we've been making all the time?
Yeah. Well, there are ways we can certainly try to do that. Whether we'll
Mm,
do it or not, right, is a different question, right? But
mm,
for example, if you look at the new Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty,
mm,
right, that just came into force under the Law of the Sea Convention, one of the things that it talks about in terms of trying to avoid impacts on biodiversity. And the treaty is focused less on humans, more on other species, right?
right.
But one of the things that it talks about is is marine spatial planning, right?
Mm,
And establishing marine protected areas, right? And so one of the considerations in that context can be trying to avoid interventions in areas that may have particularly negative impacts on
mm,
subsistence fisheries, for example,
mm,
right?
mm,
Um, on the other hand, if you look at one of the large impacts on subsistence fisheries and fisheries more generally, ocean acidification, right? One of the negative impacts associated with greenhouse gas emissions. Um, some of these approaches, like ocean alkalinity enhancement, for
mm,
example, may actually help us to reduce ocean acidification also, right? Because by definition, what we're doing with ocean alkalinity enhancement is trying to increase alkalinity, increase pH, right? And so at a localized level, that may also help us with ocean
mm,
acidification, and it might be that we want to privilege it in certain
mm,
areas, right? So uh, uh, marine spatial planning, the establishment of marine protected areas is an instrument that could help us to try to basin by basin determine where these approaches should be deployed, where they should not be deployed, right?
mm.
And at what level, right? But whether we'll do that and whether we'll take into account the kind of interest that you're talking about is an open proposition, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, you're probably going to see nations as they start to incorporate carbon removal into their NDCs, their nationally determined commitments, the pledges that
Mm,
they're making under Paris Agreement, trying to declare large scale CDR because they're going to try to compensate for their emissions, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
whether they're going to do it in a way that's taking into account these notions of equity, right, and protection of these interests is a different question. Or if they're just going to try to amp it up as much as they can to help meet those commitments without taking into account the kind of things you're talking about is an open question, right?
Yeah, in some ways, sometimes I just see in a very simplistic way. Okay, there's a bunch of us, including a bunch of the industry, produced or created this issue. Now,
Hmm.
the instead of sort of like stopped producing it, they decided, okay, you know what, we're going to introduce something else to clean up,
Yeah, yeah,
and
that,
then they're going to make it. Unless we clean it up, it's going to be a global tipping point or threshold that's coming into it. So we just have to do it anyway. So,
yeah,
in this narrative, sometimes I just fear, I'm just trying to think about like, okay, yes, we need to do this. We need to do this. It just really has to be necessary knowing what's coming into it.
yeah,
And the for that, potentially, okay, if the Shells and the Exxons and then others are into CDR storage, all right, okay, let them have it. If certain administration is happy and continue to have some investment in this, okay, let them have it. So, this is as much as a time of compromise, we might actually be able to say this is a time of forgiveness. We just have to work on the planet. To what extent will this, our fear from equity is this just keeps them in a power, right? And we
yeah,
have
yeah,
to take it
yeah,
down. And then,
yeah,
what do you
yeah,
think? Is it
yeah.
like to what extent this should be the conversation about this?
Oh yeah,
Mm,
it's a legitimate concern. What we call this in the carbon removal community is the moral hazard, right? The
right.
idea it's a term that was borrowed from the insurance industry, right? Where for example, when it comes to crops and crop insurance, if farmers have crop insurance, are they not going to be as careful in terms of protecting their crops, right, and doing things that are necessary, right? Same thing in carbon removal. The idea is that if society believes that we can use carbon removal, right, to ameliorate climatic impacts, then maybe we reduce our commitments to reducing emissions, right? And that
Mm,
would be a bad idea on every
Mm,
level because one is given the fact that a lot of these carbon removal approaches are speculative in terms of whether the technologies will actually work and whether the amping up the amount of carbon removal you need poses serious risk, right? We don't want to rely on that, right? When we
mm,
know that decarbonization works, it's permanent, right? Um, so we have to avoid that moral hazard, right? We have to
mm,
acknowledge we need carbon removal, but we want to minimize the amount of carbon removal we need. So how do you do that? Well,
mm,
there's a number of things you can do from a policy perspective, but you have
mm,
to focus on those. One is to have separate commitments for decarbonization and carbon removal, right?
mm,
Separate them out. Say, this is the amount of decarbonization we need. Then you have a separate commitment for carbon removal, and you don't conflate the two, right?
mm,
That's one thing you do. The second thing you can do is remember we said that carbon removal should be for hard to abate emissions, right? Things where you absolutely, because of either technological constraints or because of massive costs, you
mm,
can't decarbonize, then that's the role that carbon removal plays, right? But you have to be able to define what's hard to abate. You have to make sure that people aren't cheating when they claim that, all these things are hard to abate. And you have to put that in place in terms of policy,
mm,
right? So,
mm,
so that's what we're going to need to try to avoid moral hazard. The last thing that we need is if countries in their pledges start claiming that we're going to, have, you know, 100 megatons of carbon removal by 2040 or 2050, you need those countries in the Paris Agreement to tell you how they're going to do that, right?
mm,
Do they have policies in place that mandate that? Do they have funding in place that's going to ensure that that's actually going to happen? Or are they just making those numbers up? Because politicians currently would find it easier to just make those pledges without meaningfully putting in place the policies that are necessary because that's easier than taking on the fossil fuel interests that may
mm,
be
mm.
financing their reelections, right? So
Yeah.
uh, you got to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that we're actually going to get that, and that's a big task to ask, right? But it is what we should be demanding, or this is all a bit of theater.
That's where the social science comes into this conversation
Mm,
very importantly. I mean, when
very
looking
important,
into it,
right?
this is going to be a huge mechanism to get ESG,
Yeah,
the begin in turning into the financial, systems, and surely, many of those areas with large ocean states will actually be targeted for
yeah, yeah.
debt swapping and
That's
so on and
exactly
so forth.
right,
I
right,
mean, the power game is just continue to be. So, this
right.
is really something we just work on. And I have a few questions,
Yeah,
and actually, there's three questions, and then last one, we actually don't know who does it come from. Where can we get the independent information for the risks and another? Do you know what? I I'm telling you, it's so difficult because a lot of funding and a lot of issues and then all this. But this is something I can ask. I mean, the one place you could go is Institute of Responsible Carbon Dioxide Removal. You should go to their website, and then it's World's Institute. But well, is there any other places where people can really go and get independent information? That's getting a bit difficult. But do you know any places?
yeah, yeah. There are places to go, and the caveat always is I think the more places you go and the more perspectives you see, the better, right?
Mm,
But there another really good place to go is Carbon 180. This
mm,
is an organization that was established more than a decade ago. to look at the role of carbon removal, and there's certainly advocacy for carbon removal
Mm,
and the Carbon 180 site, but there's a lot of discussion of notions of equity and justice and how that gets implemented. It's a site that primarily focuses on the United States, but also looks at other places. The World Resources Institute, which is an
mm.
NGO, spends a lot of time looking at what equitable carbon removal should look at, and looks at it at a global level, and I think does a really good job. And so those are some places that I would look to for this kind of information.
And as we start working, more critical information and opinions will come from between Wills Institute and Ocean Nexus. I mean, surely our approach for the equity compensation, it's not really equitable implementation framework, but it is, we are talking about like power dynamics change. We are talking about anti-inequity,
Yeah,
anti-racism. I mean, that's
yeah,
what we are
yeah,
really talking
yeah,
about,
yeah. That
decolonization, and that's what has to be
it's
the
a
conversation.
critical role for an organization like Ocean Nexus to talk about, right? Because one, Ocean Nexus is focused on ocean of protection of the oceans, right? Which is a subset of what everybody in the carbon removal community is talking about. Second of all, it's a focus on the protection of the most vulnerable interests in the world, including indigenous communities, right? And
Mm,
that's going to be an important part of this discussion. For example, in the United States, a lot of these approaches, including some of these electrochemical approaches we're talking about, are starting to be focused in the Pacific Northwest, and there's some extremely important tribal interests in that area. For example, fisheries, right, and
mm,
tourism, right, and so ensuring that those voices are front and center in any discussion about whether we deploy in those areas, how we co-develop these approaches, how we try to ensure co-benefits if we are deploying these approaches, how do we ensure perhaps co-ownership of some of these approaches so that if tribes are interested in participating, they have an economic seat at the table, right? Those all have to be discussed. Or if they decide full stop, they don't want these approaches deployed in these areas. How do we ensure that principles under UNDRIP, social license to operate, for example, are meaningfully operationalized so that they have a veto in terms of deployment of these approaches? Those are all things that aren't really being discussed as much as they have to be. And so an organization like Ocean Nexus with a focus and representation of those interests is really important.
thank you. Well, I mean, so there's one more question, which is pretty much what we talked about just now. But Andreas is asking, hey, it's great to talk about like CD MCDR, but one thing we could really do is what about stop subsidizing fossil fuel,
Yeah.
right? Is that
But
that is
yeah,
not like that, But is
that
that that's
no,
exactly
no,
what you said.
that's job one. And as one of
Mm,
the things that you and I have talked about, one of the
mm,
things that I worry about in this discussion is that whether intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes the discussion is, well, th we have two choices here. We have catastrophic climate change, right, which will devastate the world's oceans, devastate the most vulnerable people in the world disproportionately, or we have these interventions as the answer, right? But that's a Manichaean choice, and it's a false choice, right? Because the choices are more aggressively decarbonizing
mm,
the world's fossil fuel systems and doing things like eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, increasing our commitments to to renewables, ensuring that we capture the externalities associated with fossil fuel in pricing of products so that we
mm,
send market signals, right, that accelerate decarbonization, right, and then view carbon removal as a supplementary response to clean up what can't be cleaned up from doing all of that, right? But
Mm,
job one is decarbonization and all of the policy levers that we're talking about. And yeah, starting with subsidies, right? Which fossil fuel subsidies, unfortunately, still massively, right, outcompete the subsidies that we're providing for renewables and energy efficiency and things like that, right? And that's just untenable,
mm,
right?
mm,
And and everybody that talks about being a free market supporter, right? And a lot of the conservative elements that battle us on climate change claim that the free market is their talisman. A free market is one that captures the externalities associated with climate change and prices that into products. And that would start sending market signals that would substantially reduce our commitment to them, given the massive harms that are associated with climate change. But we don't capture those externalities in pricing of products now, so we don't have a free market.
I mean, you also talk about like a volunteer commitment, just to letting the market kind of like a lead this, the recruit, not recruitment, but just like a participation, probably not enough. I mean,
Yeah,
and then I
no.
agree with you. We have seen it all the way, and but the other thing is, Elena, thanks for the question, Elena. Elena was asking, what is this? We talk about alchemy, alka,
Ocean alkalinity enhancement?
thank you. Right. Heavy metal release. Where does it happen? And she's very concerned, this very much strong, unfortunate track record of environmental racism by just releasing the metal in a place where people could, with the power and can we just be very careful about it? I mean, do we have enough information? That's what she's asking.
Yeah, yeah, a couple of things. I mean, one is what you release makes a big difference in terms of whether you get heavy metal releases.
Mm,
Certain of these minerals that we're looking at are more prone to have that. For example, olivine. Some less prone. If we're using limestone, for example, instead,
mm,
or we're using basalt, right? Maybe not as effective, but the trade-off is less threat in terms of heavy metal release, right? The second question is being able to assess the thresholds at which we get harm or not, right? We're always going to get releases of things with almost any operation, but if it reaches a certain critical threshold, then you can get harms in terms of humans, in terms of species, right? Being able to determine what those thresholds are is something that we're looking at, but we're not there yet, right? And so we certainly need to be looking at it, right? There's certain approaches that are alkalinity based that may not require us to release minerals at all. This electrochemical approach that I was talking about, for example, where we pull seawater in from the oceans into a plant on land, we separate the water into acid and base elements, and we release the basic elements back into the ocean, which makes the ocean water more alkaline, right?
mm,
Can give us that same impact without the negative impacts of releasing metals, right? But the question is that approach is very expensive. It also requires a lot of energy to be used, right? And so we have to determine if we have enough renewable energy to decarbonize the economy and run these systems, right? Because if we don't, and we're diverting renewables from, electrifying the grid, right?
right.
Then that doesn't make sense, right? So
Right.
all of these trade-offs have to be determined, and they all have equity and justice implications.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple, Brad, thank you very much for questioning. I mean, you're basically asking for, what kind of management system we need to have, not to repeat. Wow. History of fisheries and marine conservation. Nice one. Okay.
Yeah.
So, we really covered up quite a bit. I mean, for me, the one of the concern that I have is this example of the blue carbon, which is being sold to the fishing communities, coupled with marine conservation and everywhere. And, honestly, and it actually concerns David Schneider's questions. We just don't really know. We don't have a fact sheet. We don't know if you're going to ask, then ask, okay, how much does it mitigate? How much does it capture? How much does it storage? Does it really have an impact? Often it's just really not clear. And then when the conversation stops or stuck somewhere, and then people say, well, it's really there's more potential, or other model will say certain things, and then usually conversation goes into the black box. One thing, I just wonder is it's as much as we actually need a management system to understand the risk, but we also need a management system to really understand the to what extent this system of marine carbon dioxide removal doesn't really enhance or the help people in the power to just keep the power going on, both
Yeah.
financially, and then politically, because that's really the cause of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a difficult proposition, right? I mean,
Yes.
right. You're talking about blue carbon systems, right? And we know with blue carbon, in a lot of cases, the promises of sharing of benefits and revenue has not really happened. We also know that there's been blue grabbing, right?
Mm.
And 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 so in all of these cases, what I think would help us to avoid that would be public ownership models,
Right.
uh, co co-ownership in terms of communities, trying to uh, maximize community benefits, including taking resources that are not being used now, for example, abandoned desalination plants and things
Mm.
like that on land, and trying to repurpose those and use them for these kind of purposes instead of building new infrastructure, right? The focus is always has to be on maximizing community benefits, minimizing risks. But that's easier said than done, right? Everybody will tell you that's what they're going to do and what they want to do, and then when it gets uh, you know translated through the political process, right? It doesn't always look that way, right? But that's what some of the questions we need to be asking at the outset, and try to develop from the ground up a system that maximizes those kind of benefits from the outset.
Thank you very much, Will. This is one of the very few example I hope that we can actually collaborate and work on to use a new technology and to use a technology to, if I may say, the dismantle systemic inequity that we actually face right now.
Yeah,
We haven't really seen it,
yeah.
but
No,
it's that's the work we got to do. But
that's what we got to do.
yeah,
Gives us something to wake up and do every day that could be fulfilling, right? That's why I always tell my students, if you have something that you can wake up every day and be excited about doing that could benefit society, you'll have a happy life.
absolutely. Brad, thank you very much for the last minute question. I do actually question, so that's my answer. Anyway, so Dr. Will Burns, great to have you. Looking forward to working with you, and thank you very much for all the audience who came. And if you have any questions, if you're interested in sort of taking a part of it, let us know. And thank you very much again for carrying to organize it. And thanks for Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus to support this webinar. Thanks everyone, and drive safe and take care of yourself in this chilling weather. Thank you so much, Will.
Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye.